Hello, family, and welcome to this episode of Legacy Chat. My name is Rick, and I'm an alcoholic. I was given the gift of sobriety on November 17th, 1987, and it's my privilege to be your host for this episode. Legacy Chat is a podcast made by and for members of AA to share their experience, strength, and hope on all three of our legacies in Alcoholics Anonymous. And it's a service of takethe12.org. That's takethe12.org, a three-legacy study website. All episodes of this podcast will be available to listen to or download completely free on takethe12.org. The primary purpose of our time together is to create a discussion space of our three legacies so our listeners might be able to have a richer and more personal experience of AA's 12 steps, 12 traditions, and 12 concepts for world service. Legacy Chat is not affiliated with Alcoholics Anonymous, and neither myself nor any of my guests in this podcast speak for AA as a whole. We're only here today to share our own unique experience on one of AA's three legacies. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about Tradition 10 in our second legacy of unity. And I'm honored to have as my special guest with me today, Tanner R. Tanner, please introduce yourself and tell our listeners where you're from, your home group, your sobriety date, and a little about how you got to AA.
All right. Hi, everyone that may be listening. I'm Tanner R. I'm an alcoholic. Rick, I so much appreciate the opportunity. I love getting to talk to you. I love getting to talk about traditions. Luckily, I have, gotten to be the benefactor of a lot of great sponsorship and just a lot of great mentors and examples set in service at AA. And this is something that is one of the great joys of my life today. So I really appreciate the opportunity. My sobriety date is May 30th of 2017. So I just celebrated 6 years a few months ago. And it's been a crazy up and down journey. There's been good and bad as life goes, but I've been able to stay sober through it all, which has been great. My home group is the Properly Armed Big Book Study in Austin, Texas. We meet on Wednesday nights at St. Luke's Methodist Church at 1306 West Lynn at 7:30 p.m. I think I said that on Wednesday nights in Austin, Texas. And it's a great group. It is a YPOG group, and it's a book study. All are welcome. We read the book a little bit, and then we have someone expand on what's been read, and then we open it up to sharing. And we always have a good time. Really, really big, really fun group of people. My story, like a lot of people that I know, is not necessarily exciting before getting to AA. I was a very quiet drunk. Most of my drinking looked like being alone in my apartment watching random videos on YouTube about the Cowboys or I don't know, some band that I was into, and fantasizing about one day being a rock star. That was about as exciting as it got. I didn't like to share, and I definitely didn't like to be around people. So that worked for me. And basically what ended up finally getting me here was my best thinking was actually not to come to AA, although I had been here before and had heard some of the message and kind of ran screaming. I was thinking about getting into an outside issue that was something I hadn't tried before, and I thought, the substances I'm using now aren't getting me where I used to get, and maybe this other thing will. And I had a friend who said that he wanted to try and get sober, and it was like a light bulb went off in my head, and I was like, oh yeah, I could do that. And so we went to a meeting together, and I thought I'd come for about a month and get some money back in my pocket and get my tolerance down, and I stayed. Unfortunately, he did not. I'm still anxiously awaiting the day when he may get the gift of desperation as I was granted. I hope for that. But, meanwhile, I do this, and I love every minute of it today, which is great.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Thank you. And thank you so much for being with us today. I really, really appreciate it. All right, let's jump right into it. I always like to read when we're doing a tradition episode. I always like to read from the foreword of the 12 and 12 first. So I'm going to read this. It says, AA's 12 traditions apply to the life of the fellowship itself. They outline the means by which AA maintains its unity and relates itself to the world about it, the way it lives and grows. The short form of Tradition 10 is Alcoholics Anonymous has no opinion on outside issues. Hence, the AA name ought never be drawn into public controversy. The long form of Tradition 10 states this: no AA group or member should ever, in such a way as to implicate AA, express an opinion or outside issue, opinion on outside controversial issues, particularly those of politics, alcohol reform, or sectarian religion. The Alcoholics Anonymous groups oppose no one. Concerning such matters, they can express no views whatsoever. I've always believed that with each tradition, there's at least one thing that I need to walk away with. And when I'm working with taking someone, taking them through the traditions, there's kind of like the one overriding idea of the tradition. And for me, and I only speak for myself, the overriding idea of Tradition 10 is that outside issues can tear us apart. And we have certainly lots of examples of how that has happened to other organizations back in the beginning and long before Alcoholics Anonymous was ever put together. But it's just, and in this world that we're living in today, in 2023, with some of the changes that have been made, you and I were talking a little bit about this prior to recording. Some of the things that have happened in the fellowship, the outside issues or controversial issues like the General Service Board filing the lawsuit on the original manuscript, created a fair amount of controversy. How at the 71st General Service Conference, the conference approved a change to the preamble from Alcoholics Anonymous is a fellowship of men and women to Alcoholics Anonymous is a fellowship of people. And then the new plain language book that is being crafted as we speak. All kinds, that and so many other examples of how there are issues that can be controversial and that can fly straight in the face of Tradition 10. And so, I think that one of the questions that we all have to ask ourselves is, what is an outside issue, right? What is an outside issue? And in the tradition study that I created for Take the 12, and this comes directly from it, it asks that question, what is an outside issue? And I answer that in the tradition study by saying an outside issue is anything outside of my relationship with God through sobriety. Now, I don't know if that's the right answer, but I do know that for me, that is what resonates with me. And then I get to take all of these individual ideas and topics and things that are coming up and see, use that as a litmus test and see, where does it fit in or where does it not fit in? So the first question that I want to ask you, though, is why did you say yes to speaking on Tradition 10?
Yeah, I mean, I love what you read there and what you talked about. I love kind of the simplicity of, the idea that we have, these simple overarching ideas to take from each tradition. One of my favorite lines in any of our literature is most good ideas are simple. Sure. I absolutely love that phrase. And I see that to be true in the vast majority of my life today. A lot of that is thanks to recovery. And I think that this tradition and kind of that weird, what feels at times like a gray area between what is and what is not an outside issue is something that I repeatedly see it being very difficult for myself and others to find simplicity, because the world is always changing. We live in a very, very different world today than when AA was founded. And there are ways in which we try to grow with the world to better serve the still sick and suffering alcoholic, to better reach the still sick and suffering alcoholic. And in doing so, there are so many ways in which we come into what feels like might be conflict with outside issues or with things like affiliation, and those can be hard things to kind of wade through and find our way to the other side of. And this is one area where, due to some of my own personal experience with some outside issues, I have had to find personal ways to simplify it, in order to remain sober and find my own peace of mind and serenity and be able to connect with a higher power of my understanding. So you gave me quite a few options with what I might be interested in that we could discuss, maybe me coming to talk about. And this was one of those. And I felt that this was one that maybe was a little more nerve-wracking to speak about because of all that gray, but
Sure.
that because of my experience, it might be something that I could be of service in talking about. And usually when it comes to any opportunity to be of service, I say yes as long as I can. And that's just for the simple matter that, like, I'm not in control of what parts of my experience might be useful to others. And so when I feel pulled to be of service in a certain way, or I'm asked to be of service in a certain way, I try to just chalk that up to God may have a plan for me to be of service in a way that I wasn't prepared for, and that's okay.
Sure. So so we kind of started off zeroing in on Tradition 10 and why you wanted to speak on it, but I'm going to back it out just a little bit and talk just kind of generally for a second, first about the traditions themselves. I know that when a newcomer walks in the door, just like I did when I walked in the door, I saw the traditions on the wall, and I don't know that I kind of really truly understood what they meant. Fundamentally, surface level, they kind of made sense to me, right? But as the longer I've stayed sober, and the longer I have gotten into all three legacies of our fellowship, the steps, the traditions, and the concepts for world service, one of the things that I have done is I have started asking as many questions as I can. And I remember going to a sponsor at one point and saying, okay, so about these traditions, I really don't understand and I really don't know, but I'm a seeker and I'm a learner and I absorb and I want to know, and how can I practically apply this in my life today? And I remember a sponsor telling me that if you really want to learn how to be in healthy relationships with those around you today, study the traditions. Because woven through each one of the traditions is this idea of how can I be in better relationship with you, whether it be, and traditions, as you know, were originally written for the groups, right? But how can we take those traditions and expand them into other areas of our life? And we're going to actually talk about that in a minute. But this idea of healthy relationships, prior to coming to the rooms, I had no idea what a healthy, solid relationship looked like. I had to come to AA to be taught that, right? So this idea that the traditions can help us with that, at what point in your recovery did the traditions really begin to come to life for you?
Man, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think that's been kind of similar to having a spiritual experience. In sobriety, that's been kind of my experience with the traditions, and them coming to life has been of the educational variety. So there's been, I think, a lot of different points where they've just kind of seemed to like fit into different parts of my life. But I think the most concrete was actually, it's funny you mentioned how they can impact having positive relationships today, which I also did not know how to have when I got sober, and had to learn how to have here. And my wife and I, before we got married, when we were engaged, worked the 12 traditions in a relationship. And that was kind of our form of like premarital counseling. And it was wonderful. I mean, it was amazing.
And your now wife is also in the fellowship.
Correct.
Okay,
Yes.
gotcha.
Yeah. And I just so admire the way in which she interacts with this program and the way she's of service. And she recommended doing that. And so I thought, oh, well, she thinks it's a good idea, so it's probably a good idea. And it was awesome. I mean, it was so valuable to us. And there's such interesting ways that they're phrased differently in order to relate to a romantic relationship. One of my favorites was when speaking of autonomy, right, with tradition 4. I was like going into it not sure how that would look in a relationship. I wasn't sure, because I just felt like, this is, I mean, our relationship is autonomous, but how does that work? And what it actually spoke about was personal autonomy and our need to be able to have that within a relationship. And one of the things it spoke about was like speaking on behalf of my partner when she's not around,
Right.
and how she needs the autonomy to speak for herself and I need the autonomy to speak for myself. And so things like that were rephrased in a way that made a lot of sense in the context of a relationship and how to build a healthy one really kind of just sparked a new interest in what the traditions could do on a personal level, right? Because till that point, I really had only seen them as this tool for the groups, to be able to kind of see how they're carrying the message, whether or not it's effective. So I think that there are so many different, like, great applications to my personal life in the traditions. I may not have a lot of knowledge in some places where I might like to, on how that works, but that has definitely added a lot to that part of it.
Good. Staying at the 30,000-foot level, and also staying kind of speaking about how they were originally written and for the groups. The next question that I have for you is, how does your home group help its members better understand the traditions? Like, what very specific things does your home group do to elevate the importance of using the traditions as tools by which the groups can remain healthy?
Right. Yeah, I think, we did a group inventory pretty recently, and it was the first one that we've done. And that was really cool. I always loved doing that. And we got to kind of look at not just, are we having meetings? Are they, are new people coming to them? Are they hearing the message of, experience, strength, and hope from our members? But, are we ensuring that in this meeting space, the traditions are followed, right? Are we ensuring that, there's a mention of the fact that each person who shares in a meeting, the chairperson who's leading it, doesn't necessarily speak for AA as a whole. They're only speaking from their own experience. Are we ensuring that, topics at our meeting are brought out of AA approved literature, which we're a big book study, and so that was an easy one to look at. I think that recently a thing that's been really cool, that's maybe a little bit more related to the concepts, and the idea of leadership and authority and all of that, and this is something that I've seen come up in both the group inventories I've been a part of at this point, is like why we elect people to certain positions and how we go about that process. And this fear-based need that I've seen a lot of times in groups to elect people to positions solely so that they aren't left vacant, out of fear that maybe there's service that needs to be done that won't be done if those positions are vacant. And then seeing people who maybe aren't equipped yet for that position be elected to it, and then kind of be left hung out to dry, and feel as if they're not in a position to carry out the duties of that position, and the group becoming resentful when those duties aren't carried out properly. And so kind of talking about the need to ensure that when we're electing people that are, in our eyes at least, qualified to do those positions, that we feel are ready for that and that we can trust to do it. And then also as a group, taking it upon ourselves to make sure we're teaching people how to carry out the duties of a position. And I think that's a great thing to do. And I think, it leads to a lot of situations now where I've seen positions get left vacant, and that can be scary, but then, the right person for a position wasn't there yet. And they come in later, and then, we get to see that position carried out in the way it's meant to be.
So let me ask you, well, and obviously that's a Concept 9 thing, and it's also immediately and directly connected to tradition 2 around the group conscience and our trusted servants and our leaders and that kind of thing. But I want to ask you at the home group level, and actually this question just popped into my brain, is who is responsible for upholding the traditions at the group level?
I guess what I have been taught around that is on some level, all of us within a home group are, right? Each individual member. Like, and I see myself as someone who has, learned a little bit about the traditions in my time in AA and has been able to be a part of service at different levels and seen the way in which traditions can be used to find solutions for problems that come up within service committees, both at the group level, the district level, the area level, in conference committees. And so I think on a personal level, I have a responsibility to just, be aware of issues that come up and be able to start to talk about traditions-based solutions. One of which was we had a group member one time who wanted to announce events that weren't AA related. And this was a great person, someone I really enjoyed getting to see at the meetings. And I could tell when there was some pushback from the group that this person was starting to feel a little, I think, offended. I think they felt a little ganged up on. And so I got to kind of just come in and matter-of-factly talk about the reason that we don't affiliate with outside entities and how that would be a breach of that tradition if we were to allow announcements from outside entities to come into our group. Because we have people who are coming into our group looking for an AA-based solution. And if they're hearing about things from other recovery programs that aren't AA, they may associate that with AA. They may think that's the same thing. And that, I believe, can be a dangerous situation for someone who maybe needs just what we have. And being able to kind of state that in a matter-of-fact way, I think eased a lot of tension. And me and that person ended up being, I think, a little closer after that interaction. And every meeting we would say hi.
And you hit on something that I think is vital in that kind of interaction. It's in a matter-of-fact way, being able to stay focused on the facts and away from the emotion, right? Because it's so easy for us for that kind of conversation to become an emotionally charged conversation. And if we can just stay focused on the facts, which is the beautiful part about the traditions, because they're so beautifully stated, right? This is what has worked for us for many, many years. So I'm going to actually back up and I'm going to say that was a little bit of a trick question on who is ultimately responsible. In the I can't remember if it's in the GSR pamphlet or in the service manual. It does refer to the idea that the GSR is the ultimate guardian of the traditions at the home group, but you absolutely nailed it. We're all responsible, right? We're all responsible for making sure that we are honoring the foundational spiritual principles that are found in the traditions. I'm sure you've heard it as many times as I have, that one of the best ways to learn the traditions is to break them. Yeah. Right. I can't tell you the number of times that I've learned about one of our traditions as a result of some idiotic idea that I had in my head, or something I wanted to do, or something I said that people were like, and they did with me exactly what you did with him. They pulled me off to the side and they said, Rick, so here's the reason why that won't work. It's just
100%.
It's crazy.
Yeah. Well, I think it's.
No, go ahead.
Sorry.
No,
I think it's so important to remember. I had someone who is a mentor that to me that as well, Mitchell F., who, he put it in such a great way. I thought that each set of 12 principles within our program has kind of this similar pattern. The first of that set of 12 establishes the need for something, and 2 through 12 is how we acquire that. And with the traditions, he said that, tradition 1 establishes the need for unity, and 2 through 12 is meant to be how we acquire that. And so the way I look at that is, if there's a discussion happening in a committee where there's going to be some ego flaring up at times, and there's going to be some tension, and people are going to get a little upset from time to time. That's just natural because we're humans and we're alcoholics. And so to be able to kind of bring it back to, how can I make this a teachable experience and a unifying experience? If I can keep that as the goal in the solutions that I'm bringing, I see a lot more come out of that that's just so positive and helps a group to move forward and become so much more effective as a whole at carrying the message and serving the still sick and suffering alcoholic. And it does that because it allows those who may otherwise have been upset by something and therefore might have closed off in that moment to learning how to better carry the message. It allows them to kind of get disarmed and start to open up to those new ways of thinking based on what are traditions-based solutions. And that was what people did for me. I mean, that's how I learned how to do that. And so I think, again, it's another way that we're all responsible for carrying on that type of attitude with this stuff.
And it makes it less personal. I mean, it's not about me all of a sudden. It's about a greater whole, a greater purpose, right? And I'm really glad that you mentioned Mitchell's comment about step 1 being the foundation and 2 through 12 being kind of how we execute on that, right? I remember sitting in a tradition study once. PJH, who lives over in North Dallas, she was doing a tradition study over at the Golden Triangle group in Keller years ago. And she said something that I'd never heard before, and I loved how she phrased it. She said, think about this. Anytime we find ourselves, and I'm going to use the word violating just because it's the only word I can think of, violating tradition 2 through 12, we're automatically violating tradition 1 at the exact same time. If I am not self-supporting in tradition 7, or if my group is not self-supporting in tradition 7, I'm damaging the unity. If I am focused on outside issues, have a potential of damaging the unity of my group and or my district area or the fellowship. If and there's every single one of them that applies to. So if I am breaking one of the traditions 2 through 12, by default, I'm automatically also breaking tradition 1. And I just love how she said that, because I'd never heard it said before. So
that's wonderful. I mean, I think that none of them stand alone. So that makes a lot
and
of
they
sense.
don't. They don't. They're so perfectly interwoven together. I'm going to read something directly out of the Language of the Heart. Bill wrote, as many of us know, Bill wrote beautiful, small, short essays on each of the traditions in the Grapevine years and years and years ago. And back in September of 1948, he published this, or he wrote this essay on tradition 10 in the Grapevine, and it's in the book Language of the Heart. And I'm going to read just a quick excerpt from it that we'll use as a jumping off point for the next part of our conversation. Bill writes this: our best defense, this surely lies in the formation of a tradition respecting serious controversy so powerful that neither the weakness of persons nor the strain and strife of our troubled times can harm Alcoholics Anonymous. We know that AA must continue to live, or else many of us and many of our fellow alcoholics throughout the world will surely resume the hopeless journey into oblivion. That must never be. As though by some deep and compelling instinct, we have thus far avoided serious controversies, save minor and healthy growing pains. We are at peace among ourselves. And because we have thus far adhered to our sole aim, the whole world regards us favorably. May God grant us the wisdom and fortitude ever to sustain an unbreakable unity. Even there, at the end of that statement, in that his writing on tradition 10, he talks about leading us down the path of controversy, so that we can not have that and ensure an unbreakable unity, right? So what I want to do, I'm going to use that reading as a jumping off point to ask you 2 questions. First, how are you applying this idea of outside issues, no opinion on outside issues, public controversy, that kind of thing, in your personal life today? Now, you had mentioned a moment ago about how you and your now wife, your fiance at the time, had used the traditions to be able to kind of be that foundational marriage counseling, if you will. Specifically on this tradition, how have you practically applied the idea of no outside issues or controversy in your personal life with your wife?
Yeah, I mean, I think The biggest way, the thing that I thought was most effective to learn from that traditions in a relationship workshop that we did with this tradition was that, we are not the same people, right? Her and I
Right.
are different, as similar as we are, as many things as we have in common, as many things as I love about her and she loves about me. We are not the same person, and there are just going to be things that we disagree on, and that's okay. That's natural. And so for me, um, part of being someone who is sober and stable today, someone who has peace and serenity in their life, is being able to accept that she's going to think different things than I about certain issues that I may be passionate about.
Mhm.
And I owe it to her to allow her the room to feel safe having those opinions, just as she owes that to me. And
But is
it
that
leads
easy?
to, it is not easy.
It
It's
is, of
so,
course it's not.
so difficult. And there's so many things that I feel like we get into discussions about. And there is a part of me that just wants to grab her by the shoulders and shake and go, come on, you know that I'm right.
Right.
But I love that she challenges me too. And I've learned to love that through that process. I've learned to love that when I interact with people not involved in my marriage, just friends of mine, my parents, my siblings, my sponsor, my sponsees, and we have differing opinions on things. I've learned to accept that about people and to even love that about people, and it opens me up constantly to new ways of thinking, and the ability to just like share the world and the ideas within it in a much more deep and meaningful way with the people around me. And I think that if I'm in a place where I'm engaging in controversy in a way that is kind of attaching it to my very being and my sobriety and my relationship and all these things, then it's so easy to live in fear of other people's opinions about things like that.
Sure.
Um, I see that as a lot of what this tradition is. It talks about I think you might have read something about this earlier, in the chapter on tradition 10 in the 12 and 12. Bill talks about how, this doesn't mean, and he definitely doesn't expect us as people not to have opinions on all
Right.
manner of things, right?
Right.
That's only human. We live in a very big world, and there's a lot of things happening in that world, and the era that we each get to live in our lifetime is going to be filled with controversial topics and all kinds of things that are not related to my sobriety, to this fellowship, to any of that. And it would be unrealistic to expect me or anyone else not to be engaged with that in some way, right? But when I can maintain this idea that other people are allowed to have their opinions just as much as I am, I can come to a place like this fellowship and focus on our primary purpose, focus on what is at stake here, and keep that stuff out of it, right?
Right.
And I know people who I interact with almost on a daily basis who have opinions that are different than mine about things that are outside issues, that I don't necessarily like, right? And I don't have to bring that into these spaces, right? I can love that person as someone who needs the solution that I need, and is working towards that.
So I'm going to kind of keep it on the personal for just a moment.
Mhm.
If and not just with personal relationship with your wife, but personal relationships with family, friends, home group members, other members of the fellowship. Um, this idea of outside issues, if a newcomer came up to you, or let's say one of your sponsees, maybe a newcomer sponsee who is just beginning to get involved in the traditions or beginning to read them, learn them, understand them, comes to you and says, okay, Tanner, I have heard someone say that, and I'm going to use an example that I used previously, that the change to the preamble is an outside issue, that changing it from Alcoholics Anonymous is a fellowship of men and women to Alcoholics Anonymous is a fellowship of people. I've had people tell me, and this is the newcomer talking to you, I've had people come to me and say, well, that's an outside issue. It's all about gender, and it's about, gender, whatever, and it's become political and all of that. And I'm a newcomer who doesn't know any different. I'm a newcomer who is just learning, trying to understand what what is the best way to respond to someone who says, I just don't understand, this seems like an outside issue to me?
Hmm. I I don't know if I think there's like a best way, because everyone's different. Everyone hears things in different ways, and I know that I have my own ways that I hear things. I've been taught a lot, that like just because my voice doesn't resonate with one newcomer doesn't mean that it's not useful somewhere,
Sure.
right? Maybe the newcomer who needs it hasn't walked in the door yet. Um, but I think the way in which I communicate that and the way in which I've talked about it with people is just that, that's kind of one of those areas where it's become gray, right? And the reason it's become gray is because there are people who do not identify themselves in the ways that I do, biologically, or sexually, or as far as their gender identity.
Right.
And I have to be able to see today that regardless of any of that, the same way that regardless of political affiliation or religious sect, or any other things about just me as a bands that music that I like, sports teams that I root for, any of that, regardless of those things, if someone else suffers from this same affliction, I want them to be able to have this solution, right? I want to be able to carry the message to that person. And the preamble change, I thought, was such a beautiful example of how we can set aside an outside issue and still tackle something that feels bigger than this at times.
Mhm.
Because, you actually said something to me recently about it, which was that, when thinking about whether or not it should stay men and women or whether it should go to being people, the very simple question that I can ask myself to know which is right is, who is it helping to
Right.
do either of those? And I feel, and I know a lot of people felt, and this is why it was changed, that changing it to people helped those who don't identify with the words men and women, but do identify with the word alcoholic. And regardless of how I feel about their gender identity or any of that stuff, which is beyond the scope of what this program was designed to deal with, making that change, if it creates the ability for them to get in contact with the solution, it's worth doing because it helps us carry the message to the still sick and suffering alcoholic more effectively and at a broader scale.
Well, so I'm not going to offer an opinion one way or the other on this at all, because I don't think it's my responsibility to. But I do want to say, in response to what you just said, what if that newcomer, that hypothetical newcomer that we're using here, comes back to you and says, after you said that, and says, but wait a minute, Tradition 3 should cover that. Tradition 3 says the only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. And there are no gender affiliations to that one way or the other. It's just the only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. How do we respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, that's I love that kind of question. The way in which people can kind of like look at one tradition and think that maybe it contradicts with something I'm saying about another.
Right.
I think that, that's such an interesting point. Like, that's true. The only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. And as far as I'm concerned, whether or not that person identifies with the language in our texts, they're welcome to this solution if they say that they want it. But that doesn't mean that that person feels that they're welcome to it, right? And my job isn't to sit here and just say, oh, we've got a solution that works, and regardless of how we present it to the world, because it works and because I personally am willing to give it to anyone who wants it, we're good. We don't need to make any more changes. We don't need to do anything else to try and reach people. We've done our part. I have to be able to look at the world around me and the people around me that are seeking a solution for this problem and be able to do my part to try and reach them where they're at.
And I do believe that in the end, ultimately, kind of big picture, that it is our responsibility as a fellowship to make sure that we are making decisions on these kinds of things that will be what is the best for the most, right? How can we, if you go back and look at a lot of Bill's early writings, He talks in multiple places about this idea of change and how we need to be open to the change. And he even talks in Concept 9 about the leaders in Alcoholics Anonymous need to be able to have vision and be able to look into the future and see what does that mean and what does that look like. The problem that we have and that we oftentimes run into is that, and I've seen this happen, I have been guilty of it in the past, but I've seen it happen, that we tend to weaponize the traditions.
Right.
Use them as weapons against each other. And I think that one of the most beautiful parts of, for instance, the example of the change in the preamble was that whether you like it or don't, and again, I'm not taking a position, but whether you like it or don't, the thing that really happened that I think is most exciting is that it opened the door for conversation. I had people coming to me going, wait a minute, Rick, hold on. My home group felt like they got blindsided by this change. And of course, my immediate response to that as an area trusted servant was, okay, so who's your GSR? So tell me a little bit, right? So where I'm going with that, right? But and so they said, well, tell me in the traditions where I need to go and study so I can understand this. Tell me in the concepts where I can go and study so I can better understand this. And it opened the door for a deeper, richer learning of our literature than we have had in a long, long, long time. So on some level, I think it was good, but it still is controversy, and we have to be careful of that. Speaking of controversy, I want to move over to my next question, which is, how do you apply Tradition 10? We talked a little bit about how you do it in your personal life. How do you do it in your work life? Like this idea of outside issues and controversy. How have you applied the spiritual principles, the foundational principles of Tradition 10 in your life at work?
I guess I treat I'm actually right now I'm a student full time and not an employee, but I have been an employee in recovery and a student before. And for the most part, anywhere that I go, I treat it very, very similar to the rooms of AA, in that, when I am in my workplace, I'm there for a very specific intended reason. I'm there to do the work that I'm assigned to do, as I'm assigned to do it by whoever my superior is. And I can ask questions about that. I can even get into, simple small talk discussions with coworkers about what their weekend was like, if that's something they want to talk about, or I can talk about what my weekend was like if they want to talk about that. But as far as like controversy and heated debates about things that are maybe philosophical in nature or political in nature or religious in nature, it's just not the place and time for it, in my opinion. And I tend to, I definitely have made connections with people in those spaces who think in a way that I really, find to be, cool or attractive or fun, and I want to engage with that. And a lot of times I'll ask that person, would you want to get together one-on-one for a coffee or something? And just kind of get to know each other more, or talk about this thing that briefly came up the other day in a meeting or whatever, and kind of spur on an individual conversation with someone, wherein I can be a little bit more vocal about maybe things that I'm passionate about that may be controversial, but I can do so in a way that isn't going to be attached to that person's professional life or that person's educational life, because they're not in a setting where those things are under a microscope along with that discussion.
Well, I don't disagree with you, and I think that that's a beautiful approach. I do want to. This is one of those not either or, but yes and kind of things. This idea of controversy in the workplace, controversy at school, and this kind of applies to anywhere, but certainly since we're talking about work, it's where I'm looking at it from. How many times have we been involved in the past in workplace settings where it is conversations at the water cooler, right? Conversations in the bathroom, conversations at lunch, down the hall, and what started off as, just needing to vent or to get something off your chest, turns into what is our literature calls it, gossip, character assassination,
Mm.
all of that kind of stuff. That can lead into, especially if it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, into things that are controversial, right?
Mhm.
And so I think that one of the things that this tradition can help us remember in the workplace is controversy manifests itself in all kinds of ways, and I have to do my own inventory, and I have to find out what's my part in this, right?
Yeah, I love that. I think that's really cool. And I think that, for me, it's just a lot of times I find it difficult to get into controversy personally without getting into a passionate, almost debate oriented place. And so that's why for me, a lot of times I try to just take that outside of those spaces and into a one-on-one context. But I love that, being able to find my place in it and carry that with, a similar attitude, it sounds like, to when it says we crawl as God's children, we crawl before no one, we keep our heads held high, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. And on the topic of inventory, one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, this idea of inventory is a big word to some people, right? But I believe that taking inventory on a regular basis is vital to the maintenance of my spiritual condition. What does inventory using the traditions look like for you today?
I don't know if I've thought about that much. I feel like when I approach inventory, it's very much just rooted in what does this step say to do? What does the book say to do regarding that step? I do think, inventory today for me is, almost entirely just a 10-step process.
Sure.
And for me, that does play into how I carry the message, because the final step of that is to try and reach out to someone and try to be of service in some way, or just find an opportunity to be of service. And usually for me, what that ends up looking like is trying to carry the message in some way. But that's an interesting one. I don't know that I thought about that
So
much.
have you ever seen the traditions checklist? I know you have.
Briefly, yes, but I haven't gone through it with anyone.
The Grapevine published a beautiful checklist called the Traditions Checklist. You can go to agrapevine.org and find it. And when I'm taking a sponsee through the traditions, one of the things we always do, and it's also on my tradition study on takethe12.org, at the very bottom of each tradition, there's an inventory, and it's the checklist directly from the traditions checklist that the A Grapevine published. And what we do is we take, while it's written for the group, I will always encourage whoever I'm taking through the traditions to do the personal piece as well. Like, for instance, let me scroll down. In tradition 10, one of the questions is, do I ever give the impression that there really is an AA opinion on things like antabuse, tranquilizers, doctors, psychiatrists, churches, hospitals, jails, alcohol? Meaning, am I doing that? Am I talking about those things that could be considered outside issues? That's a personal inventory. One of the other things in the checklist for Tradition 10, can I honestly share my own personal experience concerning any of those things without giving the impression that I'm stating an AA opinion? Right? I love that, because it asks me to look at, and it's more than just the spiritual inventory in my steps. It is this practical inventory of how am I living my life and interacting in personal relationships with you today. So, we can use the traditions checklist as a personal inventory as well.
Yeah, I love that. And I haven't been introduced to that much. I've only seen it very recently, because I've heard you and others talk about it recently in my life, and have just kind of gone online and looked at it. But it's never been introduced to me as a personal inventory. I really love that.
Well,
I might try that out.
Check it out. All right. So the last question that I am going to throw out to you is, because I'm especially in this idea of inventory, I'm a big believer that in any inventory that I take, regardless of what kind it is, where it comes from, any inventory that I take, I am going to be called to surrender something. I'm going to need to be called to let go of some idea, some belief, some concept, some behavior, some action, some thought, some feeling. I'm going to be called to surrender something. So in thinking about tradition 10 specifically.
Hmm.
Let me read it again, just so we're on the same page, right? Alcoholics Anonymous has no opinion on outside issues. Hence, the AA name ought never be drawn into public controversy. What did you, Tyler R., have to surrender when you started practically applying the spiritual principle found from this tradition in your life?
I can say for me personally, like I said, I can talk and talk and talk. That's always been a part of who I am. I absolutely love to discuss things with people, especially things that are deep and meaningful. And I get very passionate about things like a debate setting. And so when I first got sober, I would very often try to bring that into this space. And I would have, my first sponsor or mentors in the program kind of bring me aside and talk about what a primary purpose was, what singleness of purpose was. And recently I was at a traditions workshop where it kind of, 5 versus 10 was presented to me in a very interesting way, I thought, where 5 is primary purpose, 10 is singleness of purpose. And the thought came to me that 5 talks about what we do. Right. 5 talks about what it is that we're here to do. 10, in my eyes, a lot of times talks about what we don't do. That is the difference to me between primary purpose and singleness of purpose. And so when I look at that as far as just like how I interact with people and with groups and with this program in the space of recovery, I'm sacrificing a lot of other things that I like to do. Because it's not what we do. And it connects very closely to something I heard a long time ago, which was I get drunk, but we get sober. And I have to look at recovery that way. I have to be able to come here and I need to be able to, on a personal level, just be able to conform to what the group is doing on some level. I have to be a part of this. I have to come in and engage in a way that is directly connected to this solution and that is meaningful to not just me, but those around me, because I rely on those around me in order for this solution to work in my life. And so I am sacrificing a lot when I walk into the rooms of AA in order to find this solution, or at least that's what it felt like, especially in early sobriety, because it was so hard for me to apply that. It was so hard for me to walk into a room of Alcoholics Anonymous and only talk about this solution and not talk about something else. A lot of times because I didn't know much about this solution, right? I really struggled to be willing to have discussions about things that I was not educated on. I felt a huge sense of inferiority when that was taking place. And so that was scary for me. And I had to let go of that. I had to sacrifice the security blankets that I had relied on, the defects of character that act as defense mechanisms in my life, that keep me safe from feeling as if I don't know as much as someone else that's in the room with me, and be willing to discuss this solution, even when I didn't know much about it.
Or the flip side of that, of thinking I know everything.
Yes.
Right. Because to me, that's one of the things that I had to be willing to surrender in step 10 was that I know the answer to this.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's not an outside issue. No, that's not an outside issue. No, that's not going to cause controversy. Well, how in the heck do I know that?
Mm-hmm.
I've got to be willing to surrender that. Right.
Yeah.
And one of the best ways that I can do it is to use that foundational tenet that they have in tradition 2, which is a well-informed good conscience. I need to become a well-informed AA member. I need to become a well-informed human being. And sometimes that means recognizing and identifying the fact that I don't have all the answers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. And for me, that's a terrifying thing to recognize. That was a big part of my alcoholism. It still is wanting to be that person with the answers that people come to and they trust and rely on and, lean on in a lot of big ways, because it makes me feel important. And when I come to the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, where I am knowledgeable and where I can provide experience around something, I need to do that. But it's also like, I love that, during the process of this conversation, you brought up the 12 tradition inventories or the checklists and it being used as a personal inventory. And I didn't know that. I got to learn something here today.
Yeah.
And I think, if I was caught up in my own defects and my own selfish desires about what I wanted out of today, then I wouldn't have been open to learning something. And I definitely would not have admitted that I didn't know something.
On a recording for the whole world to hear.
Right. Yes. But I think it's wonderful that I get to do that today. And it's wonderful that I get to know people like you that know more than I do, and that I can have discussions like this, and I can be of service alongside, and not only be able to help others in that way, but be helped myself. And when I can look at it from being in the middle of AA in that way, where I'm getting to help others and be helped at the same time, it just like deepens my own recovery and life so much.
You said it earlier. You said it. This is a we program.
Mm-hmm.
And I absolutely am a result today of every person that has gone before me, who has been willing to help me learn, because I clearly don't have all the answers. I know that I have, in 35 years of sobriety, I've done a lot. I've experienced a lot. I have been unbelievably honored and privileged to have been getting to do an enormous amount of service and for the fellowship and for members in the fellowship. But even still, I simply don't have all the answers. Dude, seriously. Walking into the General Service Conference this year in April of 2023, it became crystal clear to me how little I actually know.
Yeah.
So I'm grateful for those that have gone before me, and I'm grateful that I get the opportunity to share that with people like you and so many wonderful people in the fellowship. So Tanner, we are out of time. Is there anything that you would like to offer as a closing comment on this tradition? Anything that you want our listeners to remember as they begin to put the spiritual principle of Tradition 10 into practical application in their lives?
I am not sure if I would be able to articulate off the top of my head, but I know for me, like we just discussed, like the most important thing for me today is to remain teachable. And I'm constantly being confronted by outside issues or non-outside issues, and I don't know whether or not they are. Right. And rather than bringing those things into this program or into my recovery and potentially crossing those lines when I don't know what I'm doing, it's so important for me to be able to bring it to someone who may know more than me. That's right. And have patience. Which is such a big part of everything I do in recovery. Being patient, being willing to just allow, my higher power to take me through this whole experience of sobriety and life, and let more be revealed as time goes on. And as I learn more, as I get to know more, then I get to share that in a way that might be helpful for someone else. And this is definitely an area where that can be very hard to do. So it's always a good reminder for me.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time and for your service today, Tanner. I really appreciate it. I'm confident that our listeners will be able to take away a lot from your sharing. So thank you so very much for being with us today. Really.
Thank you.
Just a reminder to everyone that you can go to takethe12.org to learn more about all three of our legacies in AA through STEP, tradition, and concept studies, blog posts, videos, books, and so much more. Until next time, let us not forget Bill W.'s words when he said this, quote, "We clearly see AA in three dimensions: the dimension of recovery, the dimension of unity, and the dimension of service. Without any one of these, AA could not function." God bless.